President Donald Trump's statements in the last few weeks have made one thing clear. He intends to change what has been the status quo in the Middle East.
All of the hostages aren't returned by Saturday at 12 o'clock. I think it's an appropriate time. I would say cancel it and all bets are off and let hell break out. I'd say they ought to be returned by 12 o'clock on Saturday, and if they're not returned, all of them, not in drips and drabs, not 2 and 1 and 3 and 4 and 2. Saturday at 12 o'clock, and after that, I would say all hell is going to break out.
Trump says Hamas must free all hostages by midday Saturday, or all hell will break out. But what about the Islamic Republic of Iran, the main backer of Hamas? Are they part of Trump's threat? And the president suggests the U.S. take over Gaza and relocate 2 million Palestinians.
They're all going to leave when they have a place that's a better alternative. When they have a nice place that's safe, they're all going to leave. It's a hellhole right now.
But how are you so sure? Would the U.S. force them to leave?
You're going to see that they're all going to want to leave.
The U.S. could reshape the Middle East. How does Iran fit into the realignment? Today, Michael Pregent, a former U.S. intelligence officer with over 28 years of experience on terrorism, counterinsurgency, and policy issues in the Middle East with a focus against malign Iranian influence in the region, joins us for a deep dive.
Everybody needs to be out by Saturday or else all hell is going to break loose. Tehran is the only way that happens. If you make Tehran feel pain, if you put all of the onus on Tehran to make this happen, then that would work. Qatar has no influence with Hamas.
I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Middle East analyst, former U.S. intelligence officer, and military advisor Michael Pregent joins us now. Thank you so much for being here, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Let's start off with Trump's ultimatum to Hamas to release all the hostages by Saturday midday at noon, or, quote, all hell will break out. That obviously sent a lot of shockwaves throughout the world. I mean, this is the first time a U.S. president was so direct to Hamas or any Middle Eastern entity for that matter. Now, one thing that was missing was a messaging to Iran. Now, given how the Islamic Republic of Iran is providing financial, material, and ideological support to Hamas, why do you suppose the Islamic Republic was taken out of that formula?
Well, hopefully, I don't know whether they were taken out of it, but they need to be in it by name. Let's put it that way. As far as being left out of it, my biggest critique of the administration so far when it comes to dealing with ceasefires and hostage releases is, before the president took office, the whole Middle East was worried about that statement. Everybody needs to be released by the time I take office, or all hell is going to break loose. And then Witkoff goes there, and with all of that capital behind him, all of that Trump bravado behind him, basically pushes Biden's ceasefire deal from May, the one that was rejected. So he expended that capital. He didn't use Trump the way he could have to get everybody out, to be able to put that pressure on Hamas. Instead, negotiating with Egypt and Qatar, and they both work as Hamas's agents in this case, especially Qatar, to basically push something very weak and then, work with Brett McGurk to push that. So in the latest message from the president, I believe it was Monday or Tuesday, after seeing the last 3 hostages released and what they looked like and how they were, he compared them to what Jews look like when they
The
were released
Holocaust, yeah.
Right, exactly. And, hey, everybody needs to be out by Saturday or else all hell is going to break loose. Well, Tehran is the only way that happens. If you make Tehran feel pain, if you put all of the onus on Tehran to make this happen, then that would work. Qatar has no influence with Hamas. That's my position, because we haven't seen it yet. Their capital is, they're able to tell Hamas, hey, listen, we have influence with the Biden administration. We have influence with Brett McGurk, with Anthony Blinken, And now they can say we have influence with Witkoff, which really bothers me because, you know, I want him to succeed, but you cannot succeed if you continue to play into the hands of the arsonist playing firefighter, in the role of Qatar. If you really want to get a release, Tehran needs to be involved. We saw the release of the American from Belarus. There were 2 others who were released. So those 2 others are bad people, right? But they were released because Saudi got involved. And, we don't know what the background is there, right? But what we do know is Russia got what they wanted also in that case. We cannot be successful when it comes to hostage releases with Hamas if Tehran doesn't feel pain. And I don't want Tehran to be rewarded. I'm just saying they need to feel under threat and they need to feel pain. If we continue down the road of using Egypt and Qatar, then nothing changes.
And can you elaborate on that? Like, what would that pain look like?
Tell Tehran that, listen, we've designated the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. We've designated the Quds Force. We know they have operatives in Iraq. We know they have operatives in Syria. We know they have operatives in Lebanon. Those are targets. Those are now targets. We can increase economic pressure on Iran. We can carve out Iraq from being an economic life force, life support system for Iran. So there are economic things and there are kinetic things that we can do to say, listen, we're really serious about this. We can further degrade the Houthis. We can further degrade Hezbollah. We can start targeting Hamas operatives. If the regime told Hamas, release, they would release. When Qatar says it, they say no, and this is what we want. And then we get this negotiated position that favors Hamas, and they get, 33 to 50 terrorists per one hostage, depending on who that hostage is. And now we don't know who's alive, who's left, and what condition they're in. So the president really wants to use this position that he has, this capital that he has with the American people, this capital that he has with our adversaries. It needs to be believed. But if I'm an adversary of the United States in the Middle East, I just have to find a way to get some money to Qatar or something favorable to Qatar to give to an American working for the Trump administration to take a softer stance. That's how easy it is now, based on what we've seen with Witkoff and this whole initial ceasefire deal.
And you said something significant earlier. You talked about Qatar having influence with these high-level U.S. officials who are part of the ceasefire. Can you tell us in more detail what you mean exactly by influence here?
Well, yeah, I mean, when Blinken and Sullivan and Brett McGurk were not in office, when they were part of the International Crisis Center or whatever they called themselves, that's a Qatari-funded entity. Not solely, but Qatar funds us. All of the think tanks in Washington, D.C., to include some in the Republican column or the conservative column, receive Qatar funding. And that funding either silences a critic or results in praise for what Qatar is doing. We hear these things like, Qatar is doing God's work. If it wasn't for Qatar, we're hearing all these things. But I know people that are very critical of Qatar that are silent because the think tank that they're in receives Qatari money. But when it comes to Witkoff, we know that they bought a property in New York for $623 million. That's in the New York Times. I'm not saying that he's bought and paid for. What I'm saying is pretty hard to criticize Qatar when they bailed you out of a financial situation that you were in. That's what I'm talking about with this influence. What I mean in negotiations is Qatar has influence on the U.S. position based on who it is in contact with, and less influence on Hamas. And I tell this story about Iraq, where the Qatari prime minister, the emir, he had his family members kidnapped by Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq.
Wow.
And he wasn't able to get them out for a year. For a whole year, he could not get them out. And you know what it cost to get them out?
No.
$1 billion US dollars for his own family members, like
Wow.
5 members. And they also had to agree to displace a Sunni population inside of Syria so that pro-Assad and pro-regime entities, whether it be militias from Afghanistan or militants inside of Syria from Iraq, to resettle those towns. So Qatar had to not only pay $1 billion to Kataib Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy inside of Iraq, it also had to displace a Sunni population from towns that were considered strategic to Assad. So they have no influence on these organizations. They simply give them a bunch of money, and then Hamas officials say, continue to give us the money or else. Qatar doesn't have a military. It has a military, but it doesn't have it's not a feared entity. It's a bought and paid for relationship. Every relationship with Qatar is one they have bought and paid for. Our allies in the region can't stand this country. Our adversaries use this country to get favorable outcomes. And I am laser focused on Qatar. It's easy to focus on Iran and Tehran and say, okay, the regime is designated, the IRGC is designated, but Qatar is doing more to fund terrorism than Iran is in some cases, and especially when it comes to Hamas. But the power to tell Hamas what to do resides in Tehran. The power to tell Americans what to do, unfortunately, resides in Doha. And we need to change that.
And wow, I mean, it's interesting because Qatar is such a tiny little island in the Persian Gulf.
And punching above its weight, 300,000 actual citizens. Everybody else is there to support them. Basically hiring out a third world workforce where they treat them as substandard people inside of their own country, punching above their weight. And it's basically, Qatari funding, the sovereign fund. They own part of the teams here in Washington, D.C., the hockey team, the NBA team.
Which
And
ones?
the Capitals and who's the NBA team? The Wizards. And it's crazy. The best mall here in Washington, D.C. is one that Qatar paid for, Qatar owns inside of D.C. Nice restaurants, nice places, nice condos. People live there. People like it, right? If Qatar wasn't funding terrorism, it'd be great. But you can't have a mall in Washington, D.C., own part of a sports franchise, and still support Hamas, and still provide, make yourself available to get U.S. dollars to Iran or negotiate on behalf of Iran. Remember those 5 American dual citizens that we got back?
Yes, that was done through Qatar's diplomacy.
Qatar. What was the price per head that the U.S. paid?
It was $6 billion in frozen assets. Exactly.
$1 billion a head, right? That is a Qatar negotiated outcome. Bo Bergdahl, a Qatar negotiated outcome. The last American we got out of Afghanistan, a Qatar negotiated outcome. In each case, it strengthens our adversaries by giving them back key personnel that they've asked for, and it weakens U.S. resolve and our deterrence message in the Middle East, where if I'm an adversary of the United States, I'm going to find a way for Qatar to advocate on my behalf. And that's simply what they do. This little country punching above its weight with all of this money needs to be designated as a state sponsor of terror. The U.S. base needs to be moved out of there. I wrote an article in The Hill about a year ago. It finally started getting traction this year. Didn't get a lot of traction last year, but it got a lot of traction this year.
I read it recently, actually. Yeah, it's good that you pointed that out. Yeah.
Where to the point where my think tank, the Hudson Institute, took it down from the website after they received a call from either Qatari officials or somebody. And I'm no longer affiliated with the Hudson Institute because of that article.
Oh, wow.
And that's a big deal. So people behind the scenes, people are asking what happened. And what happened is, I'd rather be more effective on Twitter and be able to say what I want to say than be less effective inside of a think tank receiving Qatari money so they could pay my mortgage. And that's what's happening to officials in D.C. That's what's happening to to people. Now, there are a lot of people that can look themselves in the mirror taking Qatari money and negotiating bad outcomes. And in the case of every Qatari negotiated process with Hamas has been a bad one for Israel and a bad one for the U.S. and a bad one for our allies. And we continue to let this country do this. Now, if I had a surf shop, I'd give me Qatari money. But if I'm a national security expert, a counterterrorism expert, why is this country funding terrorists that are killing Americans? 40 Americans died on October 7th. But we also have to remember the Iraq War. When I was in the Iraq War, I was in the military for 20 years. I served in Iraq, multiple times. And when we saw an Al Jazeera cameraman, we knew there was going to be an Al Qaeda attack because they were embedded with Al Qaeda.
Really?
And of course, Al Jazeera is they're state-sponsored media, Qatari media, and our rules of engagement allowed us to shoot a warning shot if we saw a reporter or a news camera over a bridge filming our convoys, because that meant that there was a potential attack coming or an imminent attack coming, to the point where our rules of engagement were changed. This is the country that continues to be allowed to do things because it's not Iran and it's not Saudi Arabia. It is Qatar. This little country punching above its weight, causing so many problems, and now they're on the radar. People are looking at them, and they're panicked because they want to have influence with the Trump administration. And there are enough people inside, the Senate and the House that know who Qatar is. But again, we want to talk about Iran here, right? What kind of pressure can the Trump administration put on Iran to get those hostages released? They just simply have to say, you are going to be held accountable for every hostage that's killed or every hostage delay. Tehran will be held accountable. Doha will be held accountable. That's the only way this happens. If Tehran is part of this, and both Doha and Tehran feel pain from this administration. If that doesn't happen, then nothing changes.
How would you then characterize the relationship between Doha and Tehran?
Well, it's a pretty good relationship because Tehran keeps asking Doha to mediate on its behalf. It's kind of tilted away from Oman and gone to Qatar. Qatar's more effective. Oman can't pay off U.S. officials, but Qatar can. And what I mean by that is injecting economic stimulus in South Carolina. Who does that give you? That gives you Nikki Haley and it gives you Senator Graham. And both of them have said very positive things about Qatar. Nikki Haley, not so much before she was the UN ambassador. Once she was the UN ambassador under the Trump administration, her farewell party was paid for by the Qataris. Her farewell when she left the UN position, the Qataris threw her a bash. Lindsey Graham couldn't say enough nice things about Qatar when he was trashing Saudi Arabia. And it coincided with a visit, taking Chamber of Commerce people from South Carolina to Doha and doing the same thing and injecting economic stimulus in South Carolina. So there's a big problem here. They funded the protests after October 7th in U.S. universities. They continue to fund those protests. They continue to try to infiltrate our school curriculum, spreading, pro-Muslim Brotherhood BS, excuse my language. And they counter it with, wait, but we're hosting a base. Hey, but we're investing. Look how much money we're pouring in your country. We need to do this. Take the money and tell them to go pound sand. Take the money and tell them they have no influence with us. Nothing changes.
What is your message then to President Donald Trump when it comes then to Iran and Qatar?
Well, the president, I'm writing something right now, it's basically real estate foreign policy, right? You have these real estate tycoons, with the president, of course, but with Witkoff. And they both think because they've been able to get a foreign investment that somehow those relationships will result in peace in the Middle East. What I do like about what the president's doing, my message to him is keep going. You're basically calling out the lack of champions for the Palestinian cause. There are really no countries out there championing for the Palestinian cause. There are countries supporting terrorists that say that they're advocating for the Palestinians, but there aren't really people supporting the Palestinians, meaning Jordan doesn't want to take them in, Egypt doesn't want to take them in, Saudi doesn't want to take them in. Every country knows that to bring in this entitled refugee into your country is destabilizing. And all you have to do is look at Jordan as an example, look at Egypt as an example, look at Syria as an example. And so the president's right on that track. What I would say, if you say things like all hell's going to break loose, understand that it's as simple as a precision strike on key infrastructure inside of Iran against regime-held entities. That's all hell breaking loose. A simple surgical strike against something saying this is a U.S. message to Tehran to, expedite the release of these hostages. All hell breaking loose is not sending Witkoff with the Qatari prime minister or foreign minister to meet with Gazan officials. If he does send Ratcliffe, that'd be the CIA director. If he sends Marco Rubio, that'd be different. Those people they understand that Tehran's behind all this. I'm not sure Witkoff understands that. I'm sure he may say, well, of course I understand that, but we can't deal with Iran. You can deal with Iran. Iran is a paper tiger in a lot of ways, meaning the regime. The people hate it. Its neighbors hate it, and meaning the regime. And there's a lot you can do about it. If you want all of the hostages released, you have to put all that pressure on Tehran. Otherwise, nothing changes.
Do you think it's going to happen? That they would do so?
So it's Thursday, and we're going to be celebrating here in the U.S. the appointment of RFK, of Tulsi Gabbard, and probably Kash Patel over the weekend, right? Saturday is going to come, and we're likely to hear, well, we're still in negotiations, but we're making progress. And that's D.C. speak for, not a lot's going to happen. Now, I have faith in this administration that if actually had I wish I wasn't so long-winded with this answer, but if actually had the I don't want to say the nerve, but the bravado, but just basically, listen, we're going to get them all released, and this is how we do it. You put pressure on Tehran, it will happen. If you don't do that, it's not going to happen. So I don't think it's going to happen. We're celebrating. I don't know if you're watching U.S. media, but when I watch, Fox News or I hear people talking about, they're praising Witkoff's role in releasing that American from Belarus. So they're praising this guy, saying what a great job he's doing, and he's also going to be the point man for Saturday's release. He got all this praise for failing after the president was put in position, failing by putting in Biden's ceasefire deal that resulted in how many releases so far? Less than 10?
Around that, that's correct, yes.
Yeah, less than 10, right? Or around that. And now we want the rest released by Saturday without a change in the strategy. So I don't see it happening. I want it to happen, but I'm not a hope guy. Hope is not a method. We say that in the military. You got to have a strategy. You got to have the spine to do it.
And speaking of strategy, what do you make of Trump's Gaza plan? Do you think that it has the potential to reshape the Middle East?
I think it's brilliant in this regard. The Palestinians don't have a champion. The Iraqis aren't saying, the Iraqis are quiet. Everybody's quiet, right? And that means the president has the pulse of the leaders in those countries. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, the Qataris are all about money. They don't, they're not going to fall on their sword for the Palestinians, right? So I think the Gaza plan, there are no champions for the Palestinians. I mean, there's nobody saying that no, let's build it there and keep them there and put in this good thing. It's a status quo position. So I think by the president calling them out, saying, listen, nobody really wants to help the Palestinians. No one wants to bring them in. So I'll have to force them to bring them in. I'm not doing forced displacement of the Palestinians. I'm forcing other countries to let you in.
Yeah, and Egypt has even come out saying, we're thinking of another plan. So now, after that, suddenly there's ideas coming to light, for example.
Yeah, because there will be economic hardships for those countries based on the relationship they have with the U.S. But my concern is that for the last 4 years, they've been economically disfavored by the Biden administration, where they've already tilted it with regards to Egypt and Saudi Arabia. They've forged closer relationships with China and Russia in order to fall back and not be as overwhelmed or pressured by the U.S. threat of sanctions, because they they've just prepared themselves for that. Our adversaries have learned that you can take strong positions when there's a weak U.S. president, and then you have to hedge your bets when there's a strong U.S. president, and they're ready for both situations.
So would you describe President Donald Trump as a strong U.S. president then?
Absolutely. I mean, he, taking out Qasem Soleimani, taking out Abu al-Muhandis, those are big deals. Uh, and because of that, when he said everybody needs to be released or all hell's going to break loose, he had a reputation already. And that reputation, I think, is being squandered a little bit by Witkoff's, um, unfamiliar tenor in this realm, in the foreign policy realm. Making a deal, securing money is different than securing the release of hostages. And you have to use the weight of, the threat. You have to use a stick, the carrot. The stick has to be present. It has to be believed that the U.S. is going to do something punishing to ensure the release of these hostages. And it can't be focused on Hamas. It needs to be focused on Tehran.
And do you think the U.S. administration is thinking along your lines in terms of the significance and importance of Tehran with their relationship with Hamas?
I think the National Security Advisor is. I think the Secretary of State is. I don't think the Secretary of Defense is. I don't think the U.S. envoy to the Middle East is. But I know that if this was left to Waltz and Rubio, it would be Iran-focused.
And is that normal in a U.S. administration to have such diverging foreign policy views? Is that something typical that you see, or is this unique to the Trump administration to have all these different perspectives?
I love a team of rivals if that's what you set it up to be. But I don't believe this was set up to be a team of rivals. I unfortunately see when people would go to D.C. and they get put in these positions. McMaster was a great counterinsurgency guy, but I wasn't that impressed with him as a national security advisor. Mattis was a great commander on the ground, and he was a terrible Secretary of Defense. I do have faith in Rubio. I do have faith in Mike Waltz. I know them both. I know Waltz. I don't know Rubio. I know his staff well. But, a team of rivals is a great thing if they know they're a team of rivals. But I think at this point, the Iran-focused part of the Trump administration is sitting back and watching the others, like, a Hegseth, a Witkoff, and who else? I don't think Vance is even focused on foreign policy at all. Just go this way. And we have to remember, I was very critical of the Trump administration's negotiations with the Taliban before they left office, because they were basically saying, promise us you won't do this. And when you're asking a terrorist organization to promise they won't ally with a terrorist organization, and they say, okay, and you say, well, I threatened them, and then you leave office, the threat goes away.
Do you have any idea of who Trump's going to appoint as the Iran envoy? I'm just curious.
I think he just has this, he had Witkoff initially. It was rumored, and then said, oh, I'm not really going to use him. I mean, even if he used Richard Grenell, that would be better than Witkoff. I don't want a deal maker. I don't want somebody to say, hey, we're going to reward you if you do this. I believe in the Middle East understands the threat of punishment more than the threat of reward. Reward only incentivizes the playbook. Punishing makes you, redraw, go back to the drawing board, come up with something else.
And you have so much experience in the Middle East. For the audience who may or may not know you, can you tell us a little bit about your real life experience in that region?
Well, I spent I learned Arabic at 18. Basically spent all my military career in some way touching the Middle East. I mean, after 9/11, it was all Middle East or Southwest Asia. Afghanistan, I was a company commander in Afghanistan. Right after 9/11, prior to 9/11, I was in the Gulf War. I've been a liaison officer in Egypt during the Second Intifada. And, I was a company commander in Iraq, or a company commander in Afghanistan, and an advisor in Iraq. And then as an intel guy, I spent 5 years in Iraq, specifically working uh, Iranian malign influence inside of Iraq, its proxies, the way it basically influenced politicians. And basically, I wrote an article for Mosaic magazine that basically detailed the handover of Iraq to Iran on a silver platter by the U.S. over 20 years. We spent 20 years in Iraq and ended up giving it to Iran. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan and gave it back to the Taliban.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just going to say, especially after the fall of ISIS in Iraq, you could really see year by year how much stronger the Islamic Republic of Iran became. And it was definitely emboldened by after that.
We used them. We empowered them. Brett McGurk at the time was there. He basically praised them, their role in countering ISIS when they basically said everybody who is a Sunni is ISIS, and decimated all the Sunni towns in Iraq. A lot of those Sunni towns look a lot like Gaza after we were finished with those towns. Anyway, that's another story. But when you look at the combatant to insurgent ratio in Gaza, it's basically one combatant to one civilian. A 1-to-1 ratio is unheard of. Our combat ratio inside of Iraq during the ISIS campaign was one ISIS fighter for 60 civilians. Especially when it came to Mosul, when it came to Fallujah, when it came to Ramadi, the civilian to casualty rate went up. We were using 2,000-pound bombs to take out an ISIS sniper position. And what that does is it decimates a city block.
Wow.
Anyway, I have a lot of experience not having a vote on stopping bad U.S. foreign policy, bad U.S. interventions.
Thank you for sharing that. And when it comes to Iran, when you look at 2024, it was severely weakened, both regionally and domestically. Regionally, the loss of its proxies essentially, not out, but pretty much destroyed and demolished. You've got their biggest ally, Bashar al-Assad, Arab ally, out. And then domestically, you got the energy crisis. The real is at record lows, of course, nationwide dissent. There's so much going on. So when we look at the Gaza plan and this kind of reshifting and realignment of the Middle East, where do you see Iran realigning here potentially, or the U.S. and Israel as its ally potentially forcing Iran to change or for some changes to happen?
I mean, the current situation is Hezbollah is severely degraded. Hamas is severely degraded. The Houthis could be degraded in 24 hours. And Tehran is weaker than it's ever been. The Iraqi militias who are attacking us are now saying, please don't leave, because they're worried about what's going to happen in Syria.
Yeah, what a significant change. Wow.
Exactly, with Jelani, right? So the president has all this influence, this wasta, is what they say in the Middle East, to do things, this cachet. And it's easy to do if the right people do it. And I hate being an expert on this, and this isn't hubris, but I wish I didn't know as much as I knew, because I can see us failing. I can see people that are in positions not either wanting to do the hard right thing to do, meaning the hard right thing, the correct thing to do, versus the easy wrong. And we're seeing that. We're getting praise. You're getting praise from all circles for Witkoff's release of, or weak negotiating tactics that basically, the whole ceasefire deal is now falling apart, because we're seeing how slow it is. We're seeing the degradation of these hostages over time. And it's a serious issue. And if you know the region like you do, and you see these things, you know what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to hold Tehran accountable for everything. What did the Biden administration do the day after October 7th? They defended Tehran and said Iran had nothing to do with this attack. That was their priority because they were worried about the JCPOA, restarting the Iran deal, the Iran nuclear deal talks. Anyway.
And there was a Wall Street Journal report out citing U.S. Intelligence sources that Israel is going to attack Iran's nuclear sites. What do you make of that, especially given everything you just described about how weak Iran is right now?
Well, what happened in the last strike, if you really pay attention, is Israel hit some of those places that were undisclosed, that were non-declared, the undeclared sites. And Iran didn't come out and protest too much because they would have had to admit that they had a undeclared nuclear program that was hit by the Israelis. They took out all of their key air defense systems, making them vulnerable, making them naked to an Israeli attack. I think the president, the other day when he says, I don't want to put maximum pressure back in place, I'd rather have the Iranians talk to us than to have Israel conduct strikes against a nuclear facility.
Yeah, what did you make of that?
It's a threat. It's like, hey, I want to be a nice guy. Otherwise, I'm on a green light what Israel wants to do here. You're going to give me no choice but to back them. That's what is understood in Tehran. He's basically saying, come to the table or I'm going to green light an attack. And we may even help.
Interesting. So you feel that in some ways, does President Trump speak the language of the Middle East, so to speak?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's never speaking to the U.S. press. He's always speaking to the target audience. In this case, the target audience was Tehran when it came to let's talk or, I hate for this to happen. I hate to put maximum pressure back on you. I really hate doing this. But I would hate it more if Israel hit your nuclear sites. So it's perfect.
It's interesting because that's how Middle Eastern people talk. They're very passive-aggressive, culturally speaking, and never direct like Western people.
Yeah. It's like, inshallah, nothing happens to you tomorrow.
Inshallah.
I understand that language very well. So, but I don't think some of the people the president has put it on the tip of the spear to deal with these issues understand that. Securing funds for a real estate project is different than putting pressure on a terrorist state sponsor to get hostages released.
And that's one of the challenges you foresee then, is how I take it.
Yeah, you cannot look at Qatar as an honest broker. If you're going to look at Qatar as an honest broker, you've already failed. And that's what's happened to date. And that needs to change.
And just to conclude, Michael, do you have any final thoughts on the ceasefire, on the Gaza plan, anything that you'd like to discuss as we wrap up?
Gaza cannot be under Hamas control. That has to be a U.S.-Israeli position. I'm not hearing that from the Witkoff conversations. He said, I'm willing to speak to Hamas and hear them out. That's not what you want to hear. So with regards to the civilians, if there was a referendum in Gaza, would you like to leave and go somewhere else and come back once it's cleaned, once it's fixed, once it's rebuilt? And they were not under the threat of a Hamas, fighter right there next to them or a terrorist right there next to them. They would say, yeah, get us out of here. We don't want to stay here. I mean, I don't think they're married to that land like everybody says they are. It is a terrorist base to conduct operations out of. I have less and less sympathy for the Palestinian people every day when I see people praise attacks on Israelis, or I see the way they handle themselves when an Israeli is released, and this parading the Israeli hostage in front of all of these Hamas fighters, and the propaganda. There are a few innocents in Gaza.
Thank you so much. That's Michael Pregent. Thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Nika.
If you liked the episode, hit the like button, leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.